One. All right. You know what it is. You know who it is. We are back with another episode of the BG Perform podcast. Keeping our momentum coming from last week, we were talking about how to become a professional coach. This week's topic is going to be what's new is old. And I kind of keep seeing this come up on social media a lot. And I keep seeing this from some people that I like to follow and I think give a lot of really good information. But I keep seeing this conversation about old training working and why it works, right? And I think in today's world with so much technology, so much social media, there's a lot of things that hurt us as coaches. And almost like there's always a saying and a lot of things that I've seen in regards to like knowledge where it's like not knowing is sometimes better than knowing, right? And not having all the information sometimes gives you an edge because you have no understanding of what it can be and like the dangers that are there, right? And when you don't have that sense of like knowledge, right? Then you can't stop yourself because you're like, oh, well, what could go wrong, right? It's almost like a kid figuring out the world for the first time. They're like, nothing's going to happen to me, right? Because nothing's happened yet. Then you have that first fall, then you have that first smack in the face, and you have that first, mistake, and you feel those emotions, and you're like, wow, I don't want to do that again, so I'm not going to go near that again, right? And you start to kind of build your life out. So I think what I want to do today, I want to talk about why old training works so well and how to utilize new science and new information to progress us while not forgetting what works, right? Uh, I don't have my camera. I'm in New York City this weekend, so obviously I'm not in a normal setting. But if you guys did appreciate the difference, I will make sure to do my best to keep that because I appreciated the difference. I thought the camera looked better, the sound was a lot better, and yeah. Anything to add to that, Jerry?
I think just going into what we're going to be talking about, you'll notice that a lot of what holds us back is our own like fear from experience.
Yeah,
So, like Brandon said, ignorance is bliss, but it doesn't have to be that like more information is fearful or like more information shouldn't hold you back. You just got
yeah.
to build upon what we know. So,
I think we'll get into this. Like, I think it's very helpful, but we'll
mhm.
we'll, we'll talk about it. So, 29-minute AM tap. Probably gonna go over. We got to figure something out for
Always
this.
go over.
Got to figure out something with the time and how to make this an AM tap or make it maybe shorter or longer. I don't know. But for right now, we got 29 minutes. I'm gonna start the clock in three, two, one, boom. So, when we talk about this stuff, right? When we talk about what's new is old, like again, I've seen this conversation a couple times, and I like it because I've had this thought too, where I see training methods or things come into my head and I'm like, oh, that seems cool, right? Or I've seen it before and I'm like, oh, I wonder if that works. Like one of my favorite things to do is go back and watch like old training footage from like people. Like one of the uh there's this shot putter. His name was what was the fuck was his name? Oh my God, now it's gonna get away from me. I can't remember his name. But there was a shot putter that was
Todd Putski.
no, it was like Bjorn something.
Of
But
course, it
anyway,
was Bjorn.
yeah, he was a shot putter, and there's a lot of his training that was out for a while on social media. Like it kind of made its run through social media, just showing the basic stuff he was doing, right? And I think that there's a reason why we can call old training, and I guess I don't know timeline wise what we would call old training, but I would say probably 2005 and before, maybe like I guess or 2000 before.
I mean, I'm trying to think, probably pre-Instagram, pre-social media,
I'd say
because that's
probably
when
like
things started really changing a
yeah,
lot, was around then.
yeah.
Post
'Cause I think
bodybuilding.com era.
Yeah, I think like the last really innovative like training thing that I can think of was probably like Conjugate coming together, which was Louis Simmons. I don't remember when that was. I feel like it was in like the 2000s, but anyways, yeah, so like this is the type of thing where when we talk about the question that kind of comes to my mind is like where has modern training gone wrong, right? Like where has it kind of gone wrong to the point where like you said the post bodybuilding.com era when it was fucking awesome because they ruined that
Mhm.
shit.
It
I don't know
did.
if I
It
said
used to
this
be
on
so
the
good.
podcast, but now it's like a paid wall thing. Like you literally like there's nothing like they got rid of all the like people that were on it. Like there's no more like Steve Cooks or that type of thing. It's all just like bodybuilding.com coaches and you have to like pay to use the site and they only sell like bodybuilding.com stuff now, I think, in regards to supplements. So there's no more like, like all the different proteins and all the different pre-workouts and all that stuff. Like they used to be bodybuilding.com used to be the best. Like you go
It used
order
to be
a protein
great, dude.
shake, you order a protein powder and you get like free shit with it. Like I
You
was
could get a
wearing
shaker cup, a fucking long sleeve
yeah,
shirt.
I still have a beanie that I wore to the gym the other day. Like just a light beanie that says bodybuilding.com. And I remember I was sitting there, I was about to finish a set, and I was like, oh yeah, this is sick. I was like, back when bodybuilding.com was good. And I said that to Nick. And like it was so awesome. But modern training, outside of that, and having to pay for every single piece of information and getting rid of like one of the best aspects of bodybuilding.com, which was the forum, is I think with all this new technology, right? When we technology is great and technology gives us a lot of things. But I think in training, in regards to having to track data, having to track metrics. Like there's a lot of things that we can see, but sometimes inside of the actual like training methodology, it drags us so far from what definitely works, right? And old training that works is has and that withstands the test of time is just the principles of training, right? It's not so much like a method, it's not so much like a specific workout routine or an exercise program. It's literally like the progression and the principles of programming, right? Adding weight consistently, progressive overload, moving fast at high velocity. It doesn't really matter how you do it as long as you're moving at high velocity. Obviously, there's levels to that. And taking care of the body in terms of recovery, right? Like these are kind of the three main aspects of training. It's like if you're moving weight and progressing that, you're going to get stronger, right? And you're going to add more muscle fibers to your body. If you're moving fast, right, you're going to challenge your body in a different stimulus. And you're going to, well, actually, I'm going to add one more to that in a second. But if you're moving fast, you're going to be explosive and you're going to also train those type 2 fibers and make sure that you're, allowing them to do what they need to do. On top of that, basic conditioning, right? Like aerobic capacity training, like working the ability of your body to intake oxygen, utilize it efficiently, and become aerobic and to a certain degree, and not just what we see sometimes, like the old power lifter who can't walk up the stairs. And then number 4 is recovery, right? Like making sure that you're taking yourself and making sure you're working on the body, working through full ranges of motion, that type of thing. And I think those are basic principles that no matter what you do, they're going to be there. And that's why they work. It's because they withstand the test of time. And it doesn't matter if you're doing CrossFit, it doesn't matter if you're doing powerlifting, it doesn't matter if you're now doing High Rocks, which is the shittier version of CrossFit. Yeah, like it doesn't matter. You those things are still involved in that, right? It's still learning a skill and how you learn a skill. It's still adding weight and doing that, right? So where I think training has gone wrong is that everyone's trying like everyone's trying to be so different, right? And with social media, you see the people who do these crazy training methods, right? And I've talked about this before where it wasn't my fault. And I'm a very responsible, like hyper responsible person. But when I was training Amanda one time, she wanted to do this Bosu ball thing. And I was totally not on board for it, but I didn't want her to hurt herself, so I was kind of like in the picture. And like I've talked about, like that's not my type of training, but that's where we start to see things because people are like, "Oh, basic training is basic training. How can I make it harder?" And realistically, it's how humans are, right? We have to kind of push that limit, otherwise we're kind of like, well, where could we go, right? And that's why we've done so many amazing things as as humans, and why we've you know I guess whether you question the moon landing or not, but question but flew to the moon and landed people on the moon, right? Again, this is not the time and place to talk about that, but what I'm talking about is we've made great strides as a human race, and it's because people ask questions and continue to ask questions, right? But in a lot of these things and keeping it in fitness is like there's a reason why people are so strong and they were so strong and they continue to be so strong and following kind of this baseline characteristic of training, right? And I think we're, like I said, with the new technology and people trying to be different and stand out, everyone's trying to innovate. Everyone's trying to create a method or a terminology or some type of thing that's theirs. And when you try to create and you do that at such a what's the word, like such a visible rate, right? Like back in the day when you innovate and you didn't post on Instagram, who the fuck knew, right? Like no one cared, no one knew, no one was like, oh, like no one's watching, so you're just like, oh, it didn't work. I don't
You
know.
put it in a book and hope that someone read it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now it's like I post on Instagram, and if it's stupid, it's stupid. Like you're gonna get shit for it, right? And sometimes there's really good stuff. And I think the innovation occurs at like this 80-20 rule, right? We talked about this last week. It's like 80% of the time, the basics are what we need to do, right? And and the 20% of that time is where we can start to add on top of it and add little things in and add ideas and thoughts and concepts that we've seen. But a lot of people live in that 20%. A lot of people live in that 20% and they try to create more than they do the basics, and they wonder why they struggle or they're not progressing or they're just lost, right? And training can get very difficult as a coach to understand if you're not having a base to build off of, right? A lot of these people are just kind of out in the open, just kind of floating in this area of just latching on to whatever they can in regards to methods. And you see these people now coming out, like I was saying before when we were talking about this, is like, I see a lot of this like fascial training stuff or these like movement system things where, yeah, people people create new methods and they might work, but again, at the end of the day, the principle is overload, right? The body adapts in a certain way and it needs stimulus to adapt. So it doesn't really matter the stimulus so much as it matters you're getting a stimulus, right? And I think what people do now is they speak in absolutes, which we know Siths only speak in absolutes.
Mhm.
And when you speak in absolutes, you close yourself off to new ideas. But with some of this stuff, it really is as simple as like they are absolutely like they won't change. The body needs stimulus to adapt. And in regards to strength training and hypertrophy, it's adding load or adding volume, right? And on top of that, in regards to aerobic capacity, it's adding, load or adding volume. And in regards to what was the other thing I said? Oh, power. It's adding duration, it's adding speed, and trying to fully, at any point with full intent, move as fast as possible, right? This is why when we start to talk about like speed training and things like that, because really speed training begins, in my mind, is like the culprit of it, right? Like that's where a lot of people start to go into this stuff and they start to talk about like, oh, speed training, it it, if you're not moving as fast as possible, you're not training speed, right? Like if you're not intently moving as fast as possible, you're not getting that stimulus. And it's a very specific stimulus in a small window to hit like full speed. And when we talk about that stuff and you see kind of like the methods that people try to put into it, it doesn't in my mind, it doesn't relate to success because they're adding in layers of limiting factors on top of it, right? Like again, power cleans and things like that are great in regards to like Olympic lifting, and they're great like that for certain things. But when we start to look at it now in regards to like a power stimulus, a lot of people aren't going to get the power stimulus, right? And it's like, are we going to continue to use something like that, right? And that's where we can innovate. That's where the innovation comes in. That's where it's like, okay, we've kind of we've kind of labeled something as a power exercise that not a lot of people can actually maximize in regards to power. So how do we actually utilize this? And that's where we start to change the stimulus on that and say, okay, well maybe it's not power cleaning, but it's, trap bar jumps where we're still reaching that triple extension, or it's med ball throws with a heavy med ball, or it's I like slam ball over the shoulder with like a heavy D ball or med ball where you're still reaching that triple extension and actually having the ability to go through, maximal force and not throwing in all these skills on top of it, like pulling a bar into the catch position and then dropping underneath it and catching it and then standing it up with a front squat with, where it requires thoracic mobility, hip mobility, knee flexion, all this stuff on top of it. That's where the innovation comes in. And I think where a lot of people wrong or where a lot of people go wrong is they take the basics and they try to like pull it out from where it is when it's like it's withstood the test of time. That stuff's just not going to change, right? And this is where we need to leave it and utilize it as best we can while also finding the actual holes in the details or the nuances of like some of these other training methods, right? Anything to add to that?
I think that the biggest thing with innovation is people think that the fancier the better.
Uh-huh.
And again, I think this kind of goes back to like even like I remember 2013, 2014 when Bradley Martin started popping off and he was like doing 315 squats on like a hoverboard,
Yeah.
like the wheel ones, if you're not familiar, the
Yeah.
wheels that just move. But like people think fancier is better now, and they'll just be like, how can I make this crazier?
Yeah.
Like LeBron's trainer having him do a tall kneel on a Bosu ball while bottom up pressing an 8 pound kettlebell. It's like that's not going to help LeBron, you know? So
Well, it's
it's
those
not the
things. It's
fancier
like,
the better all the time.
yeah, and just because you're making like it's not always harder, it's better. And I think that's where a lot of these people mess up is they just assume, well, again, if some is good, more is better, right? And that's not
Yeah,
the
yeah,
case, right? And a lot of this stuff, like literally keeping it in a stimulus where, you know, someone can maximize what you're trying, like maximize the stimulus should be the goal. So when you step into, for example, strength, you don't want to get strong and then do like a bird dog row, right? Like
yeah,
it's like that's just not how you get strong. You're basically taking the strength portion and wiping it out completely, and you are prioritizing stability at that point, right? Or core stability, whatever you want to call it. But you know, true strength needs to be true strength. You need to be adding weight and maximally pushing load, right? For as many reps as you can. What you don't do is then take away, you know, pieces of the body in contact with the ground and then expect to get stronger, right? Like you'll get better in some capacity, but if you want to get stronger and produce more power and more force, you need to be able to lift more weight or move weight faster, right? And that's where this stuff comes in. It's like, and I think with modern science and like technology, it hinders training methodology because there's been so much like testing and thought and there's all these numbers now and it's good, right? It's good to a certain degree because when you know how to use them, you can get a lot out of that information, right? But even the athletes I work with, and I've worked with a lot of athletes, right? None of them like that shit. None of I've not met a single one that's like, oh yeah, let me see how I slept last night. They're like, I don't like I know how I slept. Like I'm not gonna listen to a fucking watch to tell me how I
yeah,
did, right? The only people who care about that stuff or listen to it religiously, like are people who don't really work out that much, right? And it's like the ones who are training and the ones who are going, like, I've had some ideas where I've tried with people in the past, and I'm like, hey, let's try this just to see what it looks like. Like, bro, like I don't want to because like if I wake up and it's telling me that like I didn't sleep well and I get to my head, then I'm gonna be pissed. And I'm like, I understand, right? And it's like there's a lot of things that are good about science, and like the people who know how to use those numbers, do it. Do your, have your theory, have your hypothesis, and do the method that you think is best to prove what you're trying to prove. But in the modern setting, like again, some people like it for a little bit. I think like it's cool to kind of see when you use force plates, or it's cool to kind of see when you do like an in-body scan, right? But what happens is you end up kind of putting numbers ahead of feelings and performances and awareness. And when you take away that sense of awareness, you're almost taking away the athlete's responsibility inside of the gym. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that they need on top of principles inside of training. It's understanding that they need to, again, follow the main principles of training while also understanding how they feel and changing things as they go, right? And I think with training, or with science and technology, it hinders us as coaches. One, because we kind of get stuck on, I need to see this improve, or I have this metric, or the Whoop said they didn't sleep, or the Aura Ring said that their heart rate's a little bit high today, and things like. And those are cool to track to a certain degree. Maybe we pull back a little bit, but we also have to understand that a lot of this stuff isn't actually going to, you know, in the grand scheme of things, provide us any results inside of training because it comes down to the principles, right? And I think also what science has taught us or is doing is in a good way making us question things, right? But it's also making us question things too much. And it's like, listen, like this stuff works, right? And then there's always going to be that one person who is like, oh, well, what if we add X to it? Or what if we take away Y from it? And like that's fine, right? But when you start to get into that mindset of like this isn't like there's got to be something wrong with it, and it's withstood the test of time. That's the biggest thing. Like I'm all about asking questions, but when it's been 40 years, 50 years of humans progressing and testing, and it still works, like I'm sure that throughout, maybe one day there will be something, and once we can, I think the biggest thing that hinders us is that you can't really test the human body in the right way 100% outside of the skin, right? A lot of stuff that we test and we do is outside the skin, but it's not really possible to test inside the skin when you're doing a lot of stuff because the way they do it is like needles and they insert stuff and they test like, muscle connectivity and electrical impulses from the muscle. That's just not realistic inside of normal training methods, right? But once they figure that out, I think there will be like some increases in understanding inside of fitness. But I also think that to a certain degree, it takes away what I said in the beginning, this idea of like knowledge is power, but also knowledge can get in the way sometimes, right? Like knowledge can take away from your ability to actually understand an idea and go into it with this novelty of just like, I'm just gonna go, right? Like I know if I move a lot of weight, I'm gonna get stronger. I know if I move fast, I'm gonna get faster. I know if I do a lot of conditioning, I'm gonna get, my aerobic capacity is gonna go up. And it's not this simple, right? I don't want you because like what I don't want to do here is take away people's innovative spirits because we need that, right? We need those people to ask those questions. But inside of training, there's stuff that works, and I just keep saying it, but there's stuff that works. And when you start asking the wrong questions, you kind of get got. And when I say wrong questions, questions that don't necessarily need to be asked, or you're doing for like to be different, just to be different, right? Like contrarian view. It's like, well, strength training is X, well, I don't think so, so I'm going to try this, right? I don't have any specific examples, but I've seen stuff online where, strength training is kind of, I want to say demonized, but it's just not looked at in the right capacity. And they try to answer things or they try to go about the way that they go with strength training and not actually understanding that the basics are always going to work, right? And when we talk about this stuff, like, the next question then becomes why does old training method or why do training old training methods still work? And it's just because again, like I think there was no other way, right? They didn't have anything else. They didn't have technology. They didn't have all these tests and these other things where, the tests were the tests. Like it was repeatability. It was, understanding that if I have, a certain weight on my bench press and I do it for 6 weeks and it increases, then it obviously worked, right? But there wasn't these, blood lactate level tests, and there wasn't all these other things where it's like, specific modes of conditioning. And I think in regards to training, right, in regards to what we do in performance, I think it boils down to like you have to do what works, right? And I think this is where a lot of that stuff matters. And I think that this is where um not that a lot of the creativity goes out the window, but I think that like when someone has a goal and someone has a specific date, for example, of when they need to achieve something, it's very hard to kind of look outside of that and say, let's try this, right? Because you can't put them in that position, right? Like you don't have time to waste in some of these scenarios. You don't have things where you can say, well, because well, let me put it this way, right? Like in the fight camps, I don't have sessions to waste to a certain extent, right? With 8 weeks of training, maybe one or two of those sessions could be something, but it's like, am I going to get what I need out of those one or two sessions, or am I going to stick with what I know what works, right? In the general scheme of things of fitness, you can try a lot, right? Because, for example, when I train now, I'm not training for anything specific outside of like if I'm home, this triathlon or this half marathon, right? Outside of that, with my strength training, there's things that I can try. There's methods that I can do. There's things that I can adjust because I'm not looking to achieve anything by a certain date. So if I'm super sore from a workout and it's going to affect my next workout, like that's fine for me because it's like whatever. It doesn't matter. But if I try something new and it affects someone's training for their sport or their career, that doesn't work out, right? And you don't realize that until you get inside the room with some of these athletes. And you can't have that realization until you go into a training session and realize, wow, I only have 12 sessions left with this person and they have a championship fight at the end of this 12 sessions. Like I'm not going to waste time, right? I'm not going to try to, go off onto the left and be like, oh, well, I just want to be different and try something, right? You stick with what works, you get them to where they need to be, you individualize it for the person, and that's it. And you move in that direction. And I think, like I said, with science, sometimes it gives us, it almost like hurts us in a way that it takes away the creativity, but it also hurts us in the way that, you know, it it stops us from thinking about things so broadly, and like it almost takes away the fun of training, right? And like I said, in certain settings with with high level athletes, when they have a an event, you have to be on your shit. You can't waste it. But with a normal training person or an individual or general population, you can try a lot of stuff, right? And that's what I was saying. It's like, and I think these old methods still work because again, they withstood the test of time. That was it. There's been multiple things that have come at them and been like, all right, does it work? Yes. Does it work? Yes. Does it work? And it's again, 40, 50 years since like, or I don't even know how long the Bulgarian squat method or the, those types of training methods, or we just look at again the idea of progressive overload, the idea of, how to create stimulus inside the body. These things are, that you can't change them, right? Like you can't change how the body reacts to stimulus. And I think that like the next like I think the old training methods work because they were just so basic in the way that they created them, right? There was no outside pressure or number or anything. It was like, again, it was just they did the eye test. Are you putting on muscle mass? Are you feeling better? Are you feeling stronger? Right? And then how does the performance go? Right? And even if you see the level of increase in performance in the last, say, let's say 20 years, right? Like 20 to 30 years, it's minor details, and these athletes are way more explosive. They're way more, quick. They're quick, I guess like agility wise, but like change of direction type stuff. Like they're just twitchy. The athletes that come out are just twitchy, right? And I think that back in the day there was a different type of game. It was a lot slower or whatever. And I think that, these types of training methods have to evolve as things evolve. And you see that in the little details of how things go, and those little details of how to train agility and how to train speed and new technology and new pieces of equipment and things like that. They all help that end range, right? But that general basket of fitness isn't going to really change. You still need to do, your single legs, your squats, your hinges, your presses, your pulls, your presses, your overhead pulls, your single leg work, your core, your carries. Like you do those, and you're going to get better in some capacity, right? And I think it almost boils down to like a lot of people I see get to so sports specific because of science. They get so sports specific because of the numbers that they kind of drag athletes outside of what's actually good for them, right? And we've had this conversation before. Like for me as a coach, I'm filling buckets, right? Like what don't they get in their training? And the rest of the training is kind of general outside of like the conditioning for the sport. But a lot of that they still get inside of their sport. So it's like I need to use general qualities to make sure at the end of the day when they go play their sport, they're getting the most out of the sport that they possibly can. And that's it, right? And if I do anything else outside of that, I'm doing a disservice to them, and I'm not allowing them to fully maximize what matters. Me as a strength coach, there's things that I know work at the right times and I have to use those. And there's things I know that I don't know that I'm not going to use at certain times, right? I've been talking for a while. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason that the old stuff still works is because it never stopped working. And when we look at all the fitness wearables, fitness trackers, readiness assessments that you could do at the beginning and end of every session or what or game or whatever, you can you get the same reaction from coaches and athletes. It's like, all right, well, something in the training must need to change, which always isn't always the case. A lot of the times it could be nutrition, it could be sleep, it could be a million other things outside of the training. But because coaches want to be innovative and make things work for their athletes or their client, whether it's general population or not, they try to tweak the training instead of looking at the big picture. So the training could be going just fine, but you find out that that athlete or client is up really late and they're snacking and watching TV until they just pass out on the couch. So the things that we need to change a lot of the times are the things that are outside of the coach's control. It's
Yep.
just the coach is the one person who's really thinking, what are we doing wrong here? What can we change?
Well, that's a good
And
point. It's like you can't track that's like you don't track that stuff. Like no one's
yeah,
testing stuff. And a
and as
lot of
much as it's up to like the coach, it's also up to the client and the athlete to be like, oh, well, this is going really well in here, but I guess now that you're thinking like what could be going wrong, I'm not sleeping very well, or I'm very stressed at work, or this or that or the other thing.
Yeah, and not to mention too, like a lot of modern day sports, like playing the game is like not even half the battle. It's like you have to deal with media, and you have to deal with the press, and you have to deal with social
Mhm.
media, and you have to deal with being a celebrity, and it's like all that weighs on people, right? And you can't test that stuff really, and like it's very hard to test that stuff. But the basic training methodologies in the world are always going to work, right? They're never not going to work. And I think that, like I said, the kind of I didn't verbalize this earlier, which I should have. Like in regards to why I'm asking this is like the sport specific training, right? Like we see a lot of people who are going into sport specific training for athletes, and they're kind of dragging them into this. Like you train a sport, you have to be training like every detail needs to be for that sport. When in reality, like what is sport specific training, right? It's a stimulus that you achieve in that sport that you need to train. In my mind, for us as strength coaches, sport specific training is priming the qualities they need to get the most out of their practice, right? Because at the end of the day, you get that in the game, right? Or you get that in the sport. You get what you need out of the qualities you need are developed inside the sport, right? We can't do that much inside the weight room in regards to skill of the sport. And I think with modern training, like there is a baseline that works. And to be different, people think we have to specialize more and more, right? And that we have to specialize inside of the weight room, and we have to bring the field into the weight room. And that's just not the case. And I think with technology and these numbers, it's like, oh, I haven't heard that in a couple of weeks. But I think with these numbers and the technology, it's like people are looking at, a med ball punch toss and being like, oh, that directly correlates to punching power. And it's like, it looks like it, right? But like, does it, right? Are you getting the
Mhm.
most out of that? And it's a fine line where it's like, yes, it kind of trains the quality, but we need to just work on shoulder function. We need to work on strength, right? And we need to work on the hips as well. There's a lot that goes into it. And I think that the basic thing I'm trying to talk about here is like old training was basic, right? It was basic. It wasn't sport specific. It didn't have these nuances to it. It didn't have this, oh, you're a basketball player, you have to do, and like, don't get me wrong, each sport now, like there are certain things we have to do. Like obviously basketball is a very twitchy sport, so it needs to be like a high level plyometrics, and it needs to be, a certain thought behind how we're going to train it, right? But what I see is constantly is just this idea that like the basics, or well, I don't see, but like I want to say like the basics are always going to work, right? Like even the stuff that's new now that people are coming out with, it's old, and you can find someone who's doing it before. Now, what I don't like about that is kind of taking away, because I don't think, because the next question I kind of had written down for this podcast was like, has fitness peaked, right? And this is just a thought. This is just like a thought. Like, has physical training peaked to the point that we can't really get any better, with it? And it's like, I don't know. I don't have that answer. I think as athletes now are obviously evolving, and they're becoming like this next level of athletes. Like I said, specifically in basketball is something that I watch a lot, that I've seen grow. Like the speed and pace of the game is just nuts, right? And it's like, the speed and pace of the game, the height that these guys are getting to, but there's also things like injury that's hopping up, right? And a lot of these guys aren't, they're so young, and they're not men, right? Like they're still boys to a certain extent, that I don't think they're following these true modern training principles. And you're seeing a lot of that long term in the career, right? There's a lot of guys who, I don't know, like LeBron obviously is playing 20 years, but I'm interested to see how this new age holds up over time, because they are very based on twitchiness. They are very based on speed and agility and power, right? And those things just aren't traits that you hold over a long period of time, right? Like they're very quick, they're short windows, and when you lose it, you lose it, and especially when it's like, it's very much from an age of like 22 to 27, and once you hit 27, like you just can't keep up with the 22-year-old anymore, and it just happens, right? So I think that like my biggest thing is like, if I don't know necessarily or think that fitness has like peaked or training has peaked, but I think that, the methods that work are still going to work no matter what. And I think that we can still create, and I think there's going to be details that will get added on top of it as as we're able to better test, as we're able to better track, as we're able to better guide, right? Because I think a lot of the other thing is you can't really, track in the game. Obviously, you can wear like catapults and GPSs and things like that, and you can see the amount of uh, movement someone has. But again, you can't see the stress stimulus. You can't see how they respond. Like that's very much like an eye test type thing. And I think a lot of that matters so much more than like the sport specific training. And I think that if we understand the basics very, very well, and we understand what built fitness, right? And we understand the methods and or well the principles that got us to this point where we have the ability to kind of ask questions and use science to take us even further, you're going to get that much further, right? If you understand the basics, you're going to get 10 times further, right? And comes to anything. If you understand why something is happening, when you learn new details, you're going to be able to kind of digest it and take it into account. I think this is where the next thing goes is like coaches need to understand if they don't have principles, they don't have things they automatically believe and they know is right, aka the principles. When new methods come, they're going to get lost. They're going to get dragged. They're going to get taken far away, and they're going to kind of get to this point where they're doing stuff that they don't know works is and they don't even know really how to explain. They just seen it and they think it's good because it looks like the sport, right? And a couple numbers might say like, oh yeah, this is showing speed. I don't know, right? Like I think for us as coaches, especially myself, as I step into this role of like about to be 30, having almost like 10 years in coaching, where I've seen trends now. Like and then this is something I never realized as I was, young, where I always kind of questions like, how do these people know certain things? Like how are they supposed to know, or have the information? Like it doesn't make sense because I can't figure it. And it's like it's just trends, it's just time. You see things as they go. You see the methods come through. You see all the things that happen in history. You go back and you start to read about history and you see all the things that were going on. You're like, oh, okay, so like this has already happened, right? And like now it's happening again. And it's like, okay, well, what happened the first time? What stayed from that first time? Oh, it's right. Okay, so this must work. Like this must be the foundation in which I build everything else upon. And then you start to ask questions on top of that, right? And I think that's just the biggest thing. And I think when you start to think about this stuff, like basically the idea of this episode, like what's new is old. It's not to say like don't innovate, right? It's just to say that understand old training still works, right? And just because new science and new technology and new methods are coming out doesn't mean that they work, right? But what works is testing it, tweaking it, dipping your toe in the water, seeing what it feels like, seeing what it seems like, adding it in some capacity, and just seeing what you get from it, right? And like I said, if you're someone like me who trains high level athletes, it's probably gonna, if you find something new, it's probably not ideal to throw it in right away unless you have time with that person and they trust you. But outside of that, like I wouldn't go trying a new method that you just saw on somebody who's got to fight in, 6 weeks, right? It doesn't make sense to waste the time. The average person, maybe it's good to try, or you have an athlete, or you have a client who's like wants to train like an athlete. It might be cool to try and just see what you get from it, right? Or most importantly, yourself, right? So I think I hope that makes sense. I kind of felt like as I was talking through this, there was like some thinking that I was doing as well. So if it was kind of getting dragged all over the place, bear with me, right? And hopefully I made my point at the end there with like the sport specific training stuff. Anything to add to that, Jerry?
I think the reason that we call it the basics is because it's been around for so long.
Yeah,
And just because it's been around for a long time and we gave it the term basics, people think basics need to be advanced.
yeah,
So just because it's basic doesn't mean that we didn't get rid of it. Like you said, take what works, build on top of it if that works great, but don't just throw away what we always used because you found one little thing that works on top of it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that yeah, I think that's really good. And I think, it's understanding those methods, right, that you get always come from the basics. And maybe that's a good way to kind of put it. Like all the stuff that is new comes comes from the basics that we've learned, right? And I think that once you learn that, then everything else is very simple because you understand the basics and you understand where it can go and where it's been. And now you're, that's when you become an expert, right? And I think, I think that was a really good addition. That's a great way to like end it right there and kind of, I think, yeah, yeah. So I appreciate you guys for tuning in. I got some big stuff coming this week. I don't know if you saw the announcement that I made on Instagram on Friday, yesterday. No, 2 days ago, Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got a little collab coming back. If you guys haven't seen, obviously at this point, we'll have released what we're doing, but the MFOD is something that Justin and I used to do when I had my first gym in Albany, Thrive. And basically, the movement fix of the day. So me and him are going to be collabing on some videos. We're going to be collabing on basically how a chiropractor's point of view from fixing something, or a clinician's point of view on fixing something versus my point of view, not versus each other, but how we work together to help someone feel better, right? And we're going to be kind of talking about whatever you guys want. I got a couple of ideas early on. I'm excited because I used to love doing these videos when I had Thrive. And then obviously everything happened where, I had to step away and left, but now we're back in the same area again. And it's good to kind of have that talk with Justin and be able to do this again at a high capacity in the new gym that I'm training at. Um, and yeah, and then obviously I got big stuff planned for this year. I'm excited. I got big stuff myself, big stuff with this guy. We're gonna get some shit going. We're gonna make shit happen. And I definitely appreciate everybody who's been tuning in. The listens have been going up, which has been amazing. And I definitely appreciate feedback. Both of us do. Like, if there's anything you guys think we can do better, obviously the camera situation will be better when I head back to New York again. But, anything you guys want to see us improve on in regards to topics, conversation, flow, all of that, I'd love to hear back. Message us, let us know. But until then, I will see you guys next time. Peace.